Gleaming lobby of the Harrington Grand Hotel fell into a silence so complete that the soft fountain trickling near the concierge desk sounded like a waterfall as a security guard's thick hand landed on the shoulder of a woman who had just set down her leather overnight bag to check her phone. "Ma'am." The guard's voice carried the particular brand of manufactured authority that small men deploy when they've been handed a uniform and told it makes them important. "I'm going to need you to step outside." The woman looked up slowly. She was dressed in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a cream blouse, a structured wool coat the color of midnight. No logos, no flash, no indication of anything except quiet, expensive taste. To anyone paying attention, she radiated the kind of stillness that only comes from having operated in places where the wrong movement gets people killed. But security guard Dennis Farrow wasn't paying attention. He was paying attention to the color of her skin and the fact that she was standing in the lobby of a hotel where rooms started at $400 a night, and in his 12 years of working the door at the Harrington Grand in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, he had developed very specific ideas about who belonged in a place like this. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was calm. Genuinely, utterly calm. The way the surface of deep water is calm, with no indication of what moves beneath it. "We've had a complaint," Farrow said, squaring his shoulders, his chest inflating with borrowed importance. "A guest reported someone matching your description, loitering in the corridor near the executive suites on the 14th floor. I need to verify your reason for being here, and if you can't provide adequate identification proving you're a registered guest, I'm going to have to escort you from the premises." He expected what he always got: embarrassment, fumbling, apology, the reflexive flinch of someone who didn't want trouble, who would quietly gather their things and leave to avoid a scene. It was a tactic he had refined over years, and it worked because the people he deployed it against, always a specific category of person, were conditioned by a lifetime of experience to know that fighting back cost more than walking away. Colonel Isabelle Fontenot-Ward did not flinch. She was 44 years old, and she had spent the last 22 of those years in the United States Army. She had commanded a military intelligence battalion in Kandahar. She had briefed 3-star generals in rooms with no windows, and done it without notes. She had been awarded the Legion of Merit, 2 meritorious service medals, and a commendation for valor that the Army had quietly declined to publicize for reasons of national security. She had survived things that would have broken Dennis Farrow into pieces small enough to lose in a carpet, and she was standing in the lobby of the Harrington Grand because she was the keynote speaker at the Southeastern Defense Contractors Summit, being held in the hotel's grand ballroom at 9 o'clock the following morning. She had arrived the night before specifically to rest. She looked at Dennis Farrow the way she had once looked at an Afghan warlord who had tried to intimidate her across a negotiating table, with complete, weaponized patience. "A complaint," she repeated. "From whom?" Farrow's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected a question. People being removed from lobbies did not usually ask questions. "That's confidential." "I see." Isabelle reached into the breast pocket of her wool coat and produced a key card. She held it out. "Room 1407. I checked in at 6:45 this evening. My name is on the reservation. I'd suggest you run it." Farrow looked at the key card. Something flickered behind his eyes, a brief rational hesitation, before his ego steamrolled it into silence. He didn't take the card. "Key cards can be lost and found. I still need to see photo identification, and I need you to come with me to the security office while we sort this out." "Sort this out," she said softly. "While I stand in a security office like a shoplifter?" "Ma'am, I don't want to make this difficult." "Then don't." Her voice dropped half a register, losing any remaining conversational warmth and taking on the flat, unhurried tone of a woman who had given her last warning. "I am a registered guest of this hotel. I have a key card with my room number on it. I've been standing in this lobby for less than 3 minutes, and in that time, I have watched you walk directly past 2 other guests, neither of whom looks like me, without stopping once to ask for their identification or their reason for being here. So let's be honest about what's actually happening." The fountain kept trickling. A bellman near the elevator bank had stopped pretending to adjust luggage and was simply watching. 2 women in cocktail dresses who'd been crossing the lobby toward the bar had paused, their heels silent on the marble. "Colonel Fontenot-Ward." A new voice entered the lobby from the direction of the elevator bank. It was warm, confident, and moving quickly. "I am so sorry. I was on the phone when your car pulled up, or I would have been down here to meet you." The man crossing the lobby floor was Mitchell Greer, the hotel's general manager, a compact, silver-haired man in a dark suit who had been in hospitality for 30 years and could read the temperature of a lobby the way a sailor reads weather. He had seen Farrow moving toward the corner from the mezzanine level above and had come down the stairs at something approaching a jog. He extended his hand. "It's an honor to have you with us. I hope the drive wasn't too bad." Isabelle shook his hand without breaking her gaze from Farrow. "Mr. Greer," she said pleasantly, "your security staff has asked me to accompany them to an office to verify that I'm a registered guest." Greer turned to look at Farrow. The expression on his face was not angry, not immediately. It was something quieter and more dangerous. It was the look of a man calculating the full scope of a disaster in real time. "Dennis," Greer said, his voice carefully controlled, "Colonel Fontenot-Ward is the keynote speaker for the summit tomorrow. She is registered in Suite 1407, one of our premium executive suites. She is, in fact, one of our most important guests this week." Farrow's face went through several colors. "I received a complaint." "From whom?" Isabelle asked again, with the same precise, unruffled calm she'd used the first time. Farrow opened his mouth, closed it. The complaint had come from a guest in 1412 who had called the front desk to report a woman in the corridor who didn't look like she belonged there. The front desk had routed it to Farrow. At no point had anyone stopped to ask the obvious question. Didn't belong there by whose standard exactly? "I was acting on information," Farrow managed. "I had no way of knowing." "You had my key card," Isabelle said. "You had my room number. You had me standing in front of you telling you I was a guest. The only thing you chose not to have was the willingness to accept that information from me specifically." She tilted her head slightly. "I wonder why that might be." The lobby had gone very still. The bellman had stopped pretending entirely. A couple near the revolving doors had turned around. From the bar, a man in a conference lanyard had stepped halfway into the lobby, drawn by the silence the way people are always drawn by the particular silence that precedes something important. Greer looked at Farrow with an expression that had quietly progressed from calculation to decision. "Dennis, please return to your post. I'll come find you shortly." His voice was even, but it had the specific evenness of a door being closed. "Colonel, I cannot apologize enough. Please, let me personally escort you upstairs, and anything you need tonight is on the hotel." Isabelle didn't move immediately. She looked at Farrow for a long moment. Not with anger, but with something more uncomfortable than anger, with the steady, clear-eyed recognition of a woman who had seen this before and was no longer surprised by it, only tired of it, and absolutely no longer willing to quietly absorb it. "One question," she said to Farrow. "The guest who complained about seeing someone who didn't belong on the 14th floor. Did they describe what I was wearing?" Farrow hesitated. "A dark coat." "Did they describe anything else?" The silence told her everything. She picked up her overnight bag, nodded to Greer, and walked toward the elevator with the precise, unhurried posture of someone who had crossed worse terrain than a hotel lobby on a Thursday night in November. What happened next, however, was not something Dennis Farrow saw coming, because if he had understood who Isabelle Fontenot-Ward actually was, not just her rank, not just her awards, but the specific texture of the career she had built over 2 decades, he would have known that a woman who had spent years collecting intelligence, documenting patterns, and building airtight cases for review boards did not leave situations like this behind her without leaving something else behind first. Upstairs in Suite 1407, Isabelle set her bag on the luggage rack, sat in the chair by the window, and looked out at the Charleston harbor for exactly 4 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and made 3 calls. The first was to Brigadier General Louis Tate Covington, the presiding officer of the Southeastern Defense Contractors Summit, whose opening dinner she had attended 2 hours earlier at a venue 6 blocks away. She told him what had occurred in the lobby. She told him calmly, clearly, and in precise chronological order, the way she briefed everything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a pause, and then he said, "Isabelle, I am going to make a call." The second call she made was to her attorney, a woman named Claire Osei-Prempeh, who specialized in civil rights litigation and who answered on the second ring despite it being past 10 o'clock, because Isabelle Fontenot-Ward was the kind of client you answered for at any hour. The third call she made was to a sister, because even colonels need to tell somebody what just happened. Downstairs, Dennis Farrow was sitting in the security office staring at the wall when Mitchell Greer walked in and sat down across from him. Greer set a thin printed sheet on the desk between them. A single page from Isabelle's guest profile. Printed from the hotel's system, it listed her reservation details, her summit credentials, and, because the summit organizers had submitted it with her registration materials, a brief professional biography. Farrow looked at the page. He read it once. Then he read it again. The second read was slower. U.S. Army Colonel, Greer said quietly. 22 years of service, current Director of Strategic Intelligence Programs at the Department of Defense. Recipient of the Legion of Merit. He paused. And, as of 8 months ago, Dennis, the subject of a profile in the Washington Post's Veterans in Leadership series. Which means there are journalists at this summit who know exactly who she is. Farrow's mouth went dry. I was acting on a guest complaint. You were acting on the assumption that a black woman in an expensive coat didn't belong in an expensive lobby, Greer said. His voice wasn't raised. It was the tone of a man who had operated in customer service long enough to recognize an unclosable wound when one had just been opened, and you made that assumption in front of witnesses after she showed you her room key, after she identified herself, and in a hotel that is hosting a federal defense summit with 800 government contractors and 3 active duty generals in attendance. He folded his hands. I need your badge and your access card, tonight. Farrow blinked. You're firing me. The decision's above my level now, Greer said simply. But yes. By 9 o'clock the next morning, before Isabelle had finished her coffee in Suite 1407, the Assistant General Manager had personally hand-delivered a written apology on Harrington Grand letterhead, signed by the Regional Vice President of Operations, who had been reached the previous night. By 9:15, the guest in room 1412 who had filed the original complaint, a man named Arthur Dempsey, who was attending the summit as a vendor representative, had received a formal notice from the hotel that his stay was being terminated and his room charge refunded, and that he was welcome to seek accommodation elsewhere. By 9:30, Claire Osei-Prempeh had filed a formal complaint with the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission and had contacted the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division to notify them of a potential patent issue at the Harrington Grand's Charleston property. That last part, the patent issue, was the part that quietly unraveled everything. Because Claire Osei-Prempeh did not file complaints the way most people imagine legal action working, as a single shot fired in a specific direction. She filed them the way Isabelle had once described a good intelligence operation, wide, patient, and designed to expose everything connected to the original target. Within 48 hours of the initial complaint, the Civil Rights Division had requested 3 years of incident reports from the hotel's security logs. Within 72 hours, a patent analyst at the commission had flagged what those logs contained. 11 documented incidents over 30 months in which hotel security had been called to remove or question a guest. And in 9 of those 11 cases, the guest in question was black. Dennis Farrow had not invented this behavior in a single evening. He had been practicing it, refining it, and deploying it against people who had no 4-star sponsor or attorney on speed dial. He had been doing it in a hotel that either didn't notice or chose not to look. The disciplinary review took place in the corporate offices of Harrington Hospitality Group in Atlanta 3 weeks later. Farrow attended without legal representation because he couldn't afford the kind of attorney that corporate employment disputes required. Across the table from him sat the company's chief of human resources, their regional legal counsel, and, via video conference on a screen at the end of the table, a representative from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The 9 incidents in the security logs were presented one by one. In 7 of them, the guests involved had not filed formal complaints, not because nothing had happened, but because complaining about a hotel security guard in a city where you're visiting for a conference requires time, energy, and a belief that the complaint will matter. And most people who have spent their lives being told implicitly and explicitly that complaints like theirs don't matter have stopped spending that energy. They had simply left, gone back to their rooms, or left the hotel entirely, and swallowed it the way they had swallowed every similar thing before it, because the cost of fighting was too high and the odds were too familiar. but their incidents were documented. The logs had recorded the calls. The camera footage had been preserved because Harrington Grand kept 90 days of lobby security footage as standard practice, and Farrow's pattern had been captured in high definition, time-stamped clarity. In each of these 9 incidents, the HR director said, setting the final report on the table, "You initiated contact with a guest in a manner inconsistent with documented security protocols. In 7 of the 9 cases, the guest was black. In 6 of those 7, you had no prior indication of any disturbance or complaint when you made initial contact. You approached them on visual assessment alone." Farrow was quiet for a long time. "I was doing my job." "You were doing something," the HR director replied. "It wasn't your job." The termination was effective immediately. The civil settlement that Harrington Hospitality Group reached with Claire Osei-Prempeh's office, covering Isabelle's experience as well as the identified prior incidents, was not publicly disclosed in its dollar amount, but the terms included mandatory third-party civil rights training for all security and front desk staff at every Harrington Grand property nationwide, a revised guest interaction protocol developed in consultation with a civil rights organization, and the installation of an independent incident review board to assess any security-initiated guest removal going forward. Arthur Dempsey, the man who had filed the original complaint from room 1412, lost his vendor contract with the Defense Summit's organizing body. Brigadier General Tate Covington had made a second phone call the morning after the incident, this one to the Summit's procurement director. Dempsey's company was removed from the approved vendor list pending a review of conduct. The review concluded quickly. On the morning after the summit's second day, Isabelle Fontenot-Ward stood at a podium in the Grand Ballroom of the Harrington Grand Hotel, the same building where, 36 hours earlier, she had been asked to prove she belonged, and delivered a keynote address on the future of intelligence sharing frameworks in multinational defense partnerships to 800 professionals who gave her a standing ovation when she finished. She did not mention the lobby. She did not need to. The work was the answer. It had always been the answer. But 2 weeks later, when a reporter from the Post and Courier reached out after Claire Osei-Prempeh's complaint became a matter of public record, Isabelle gave a short statement. She did not perform outrage. She did not speak with bitterness. She said simply and precisely the way she said everything. "I've spent 22 years serving this country in environments where I had to earn trust daily, in conditions that most people will never encounter. I've never asked anyone to take my credentials on faith. I've always been willing to show my work. What I am no longer willing to do is show my work to someone who has already decided the answer before I've spoken." Dennis Farrow didn't stop me because I looked suspicious. He stopped me because I looked like someone he had decided didn't belong. That decision cost him his career, cost his employer a federal civil rights review, and cost a vendor his government contract. And the 10 other people he did it to before me, the ones who didn't have a general's phone number in their contacts, they deserve the same outcome. I hope this is the beginning of them getting it. The statement ran in 3 regional papers and was shared widely enough that by the following week, it had surfaced in a roundup of civil rights incidents at major hotel chains that prompted 2 other Harrington Grand properties in different states to voluntarily request third-party audits of their own security practices. Dennis Farrow, meanwhile, was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in North Charleston, unable to find employment in private security because the termination and the civil rights finding had attached themselves to his professional history with the permanence of a federal record. He had 12 years of experience that was now a liability instead of an asset. The uniform was gone. The borrowed authority was gone. The carefully maintained fiction that a badge and a chest puffed with certainty gave him the right to decide who belonged somewhere. That was gone most thoroughly of all. Because the thing about power, used as a weapon against people who are simply trying to exist in a space they've paid to be in, is that it is not actually power. It is fear dressed up in a lanyard and a radio. And fear, when it finally encounters someone who has faced real danger in real places and came home decorated for it, does not hold its shape for long. True authority never needs to announce itself in a hotel lobby. It shows up the next morning, stands at a podium, and fills a room. If this story of quiet strength, hard-won justice, and the very specific satisfaction of watching arrogance meet its reckoning hit home for you, hit the like button and share this with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe to Echoes of Justice and ring that notification bell. Because the scales don't always balance loudly, but they always balance. I keep coming back to the moment Isabelle held out that key card and Farrow refused to take it. That's the moment everything is really. Not the firing, not the federal complaint, not the civil rights audit that eventually swept through every Harrington Grand property in the country. All of that came later, but the whole story lived inside that one gesture. A woman extending proof, and a man choosing not to receive it, because receiving it would have required him to revise a conclusion he'd already made before she opened her mouth. I think about what it takes to stand the way she stood, not to shout, not to perform outrage for the room, just to stay exactly where you are, speak exactly what is true, and refuse to absorb someone else's contempt as though it belongs to you. That's not a small thing. That's something most people spend a lifetime trying to build in themselves and never quite finish. It requires a particular kind of integrity. Not the integrity of following rules when someone's watching, but the integrity of knowing who you are so thoroughly that someone else's denial of it simply cannot find purchase. Farrow looked at Isabelle and decided she didn't belong. She looked back and knew, with 22 years of evidence behind her, that he was wrong. The difference between those two positions is the difference between borrowed authority and the real thing. What strikes me about Isabelle isn't her rank, although the rank matters in how the story resolved. What strikes me is the clarity she brought to every single moment of that encounter. She didn't react emotionally when she could have. She asked precise questions. She noted exactly what she'd observed, that Farrow had walked past 2 other guests without stopping, and she named it plainly, without drama. That kind of clarity under pressure isn't luck. It's the product of years of training your mind to stay accurate when everything around you is designed to make you doubt yourself. Intelligence, the real kind, isn't about credentials. It's about seeing clearly when seeing clearly is the hardest thing to do. And then there's what she did afterward. She could have swallowed it. She could have told herself it wasn't worth the fight, that she had a keynote to prepare, that complaining would make her the story instead of her work. A lot of people would have made that calculation and let it go. Instead, she sat by that harbor window for 4 minutes and then picked up her phone. Not out of revenge, out of the understanding that the 10 people Farrow had done this to before her, the ones who walked away quietly, deserved to have someone fight back on their behalf when that someone finally had the standing to do it. That's not stubbornness. That's a choice to spend your strength on something that matters beyond yourself. The consequences weren't instant. They took weeks, then months. The audit, the settlement terms, the vendor contract that disappeared, Farrow's professional record that followed him to every subsequent job application. Cause doesn't always produce effect on the timeline we'd prefer, but it produces it. Actions have weight, and that weight accumulates, and eventually, the structure built on the wrong foundation runs out of room to keep standing. Farrow lost his uniform. Isabelle walked into the grand ballroom the next morning and filled it. I don't think you need a 4-star sponsor or an attorney on speed dial to take something from this. You need the same things Isabelle had. The moral clarity to know what's right and say it out loud. The mental discipline to stay accurate under pressure. And the willingness to keep going when the easier thing would be to absorb the damage quietly and move on. Those 3 things together. They don't guarantee the outcome, but they are the only foundation from which the right outcome ever becomes possible. The scales always balance. Sometimes slowly, but always.